G'day and welcome to the Humans of Agriculture podcast. Today we're on Ngunnawal country and I'd like to extend my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I'd like to say g'day to any Torres Strait Islander or Indigenous people that are tuning in and extend my respects to your mob wherever they are. Olympia Yarger, it's good to sit down with you.
So good to be with you, Ollie. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me at your place. We're down here in Canberra. You're certainly someone who's well known in agriculture circles, but I'm not sure how many of my audience will be familiar with you and your story.
Sure.
And I think we can take the path of the insect lady and that story and everything you're doing there. But I'm actually really keen to understand more about who you are, what's driving you, how you've got to where you are and how you're building that team and people around you.
Yeah, let's do it. It'll be fun.
Beauty. Can you, well, firstly, where are we? We're in Canberra, but we're out on the outskirts of town.
We are. So we're technically still in Canberra and we're in the city limits. We're in the industrial zone of Canberra called Hume, and we're at Goterra headquarters and our Canberra plant. So, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about Goterra? Sure.
Goterra is a waste management technology company. So we've developed technology that farms insects autonomously, and as a function of farming insects autonomously, we require large amounts of food waste. So we accept food waste as a fee for service. So we manage people's food waste on a per tonne basis, and we feed that waste to our insects. And we've got the technology so that we can send the insects wherever we like to manage food wherever people need us to manage it. And so we've sort of created this distribution capability of managing food waste wherever people need it. It's like landfill on demand.
And so how does it work from start to finish?
Sure.
The process?
Yeah, so we're farming a species of insect called the black soldier fly. Essentially, you throw your food waste away, whether you are a business or a retail or a manufacturer or a farmer or an office, and your food waste is collected. So it's collected either by your cleaning crew or by a waste distributor, and then whoever collects it is bringing it back to us. So if the unit's on site, they're going to bring it downstairs to the loading dock where all the other waste handling equipment is. Otherwise, it's going to get picked up in a truck and brought to us. We accept that waste and then we macerate it and we treat it. And so we're taking the packaging off and we're getting it ready to be fed to insects. And then we put it into a storage tank and then our robots are connected to those storage tanks. So every day, those tanks are going to draw off those robots are going to draw off those tanks and feed the insects inside the robots. So a fully autonomous system to manage food waste. So it completely changed how we're managing the food waste, but we haven't disrupted any parts of our clients' lives. So it's pretty cool.
It is. So you're essentially taking food waste that otherwise would go straight into landfill.
Correct.
So you're taking the greenhouse gas emissions out of there.
Almost completely. Yeah, not entirely. There's still greenhouse gas emissions related to insect farming. It's about 1,700 CO2 equivalent kilos per tonne of waste to landfill and only 35 CO2 equivalent kilos per tonne of waste to insects.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't do the maths on what that is, but it's
less.
A lot. I was trying.
Yeah, just it's all right. Don't go.
We better jump into just a light question, and it comes from a previous guest.
Sure.
And her question was, what are you doing to make the world a better place?
Yeah, right. Oh, that's such a hard one to answer because there's so many different perspectives. Like at a superficial sort of the big vision piece, what we're doing to make the world a better place is to create circular economy capability. So we all talk about the circular economy and we're like, oh, we have to reuse, recycle, valorize and all of those things. And that sounds like a super great idea on a slide deck or on a piece of paper. But like, how do you do that if you don't have the technology to valorize or change the pathways? And so when we talk about circular economy a lot, it's like one or two links to the circle. What we're doing is adding like 7. And so you're really creating capability for people to adopt recycling practices wherever they are, whatever food waste they have, creating offtake that can be used in a multitude of different ways in a variety of different industries that has value as is, doesn't need to be valorized much further. And then it's circular in its nature because it just goes right back around. So at a sort of really high level, that's what we're doing to make the world a better place, is enabling the circular economy, which we need to do so that we can, stop overusing what we produce. Yeah.
And is it something which just comes to you overnight, this idea?
No, it comes after significant errors and lots of pain. But insect farming is not new. People have been doing it for centuries. And then in this new wave of trying to do better in the world, sort of the last 2 decades, people have been farming insects in different ways. I come from conventional agriculture. And so when I was farming insects, I was like, we're going to build a big factory like that. Like I was just going to follow that model. And it made sense to me because it's intensive farming systems, feedlotting, poultry production, whatever. But then I was like, where the hell am I getting all this waste from? And when you first start, you have this it's like, I look back now, I'm like, oh, that was an adorable idea, right? Because I was building this colony and I'm like, we'll get the food waste from this kind of waste stream or that kind of waste stream. And then we'll mix it into a blend and that will mean that the protein is better quality. And then you get all these maggots and you're like, I just need something to feed them. I don't really care. I need to feed these. And then you realize that, waste is way different to what I imagined. And all of the problems that come from feeding agriculture, low cost input formulas, where are you going to get all the, everyone will say things silly like brewer's grain's really cheap. And it's like, where am I getting brewer's grain out the back of nowhere? Or, chicken manure is really cheap if you want to put it on your paddock. And it's like, I live out the back of the cost of transporting it is insane. So it's always going to be about access to input or output. And so I realized really quickly that all I'd done is just recreate the same problems that intensive agriculture suffers, but trying to use a substrate that's even more distributed, because at least corn is grown in large quantities in one place, right? Yeah. And it comes to you in large quantities. Food waste is small quantities, 500 kilos a week, a ton a week, a ton a day. That's small. It's really small. And you don't recognize that when you first start insect farming because you don't know what a ton of food waste looks like. And now we see 50 tons and we're like, yeah. And so, we always laugh our first day of 100 ton a day, we'll be like, whoa. But, technically on waste management volumes, that's still, yeah.
How have you gone? We're going to jump around a lot
right.
here, I reckon. We'll make it fun.
There's lots going on.
As an entrepreneur, as a business person, you started off with this big ambition.
Yeah.
How'd you go as you actually came back, and I'll say this politely, but back to reality of what was possible and what you could actually do to make influence? What was that like?
It's sort of interesting because I'm kind of a really singular human. I get kind of narrow and I'm like, just make it happen. And so I just sort of get head. Yeah, that's right. It's head down and then I'm like, whoa, where is everyone? And so I don't think I was necessarily consciously evolving so much as I was just sort of I kept throwing myself at the problem and then parts would fall over and others wouldn't. And then you're literally just in front of yourself trying to solve each problem as they come up. And then you look up and you're like, oh, so maggot robots, that's what we're doing. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't necessarily a very, clear cut picture of I'm going to make a thing. And then it was sort of first realizing that, I didn't have a solution if we were going to continue to farm insects the same way. And then from there, how would this have to work? And then from that, then it was getting to know what it actually means to farm that way. So, and I think if you compare it, create the analogy for conventional agriculture, it's sort of it's like if you were cropping regular crops and then suddenly you decide you want to go to cannabis or something. And so it's what gear do we need? Do we have the gear? Do we have to put the urea on in spring or summer? When it's learning the different things, a different tempo to the farming system so that you can do better. So organically is probably the better answer for that. Yeah.
On the fly. On the pun?
Yes. All right.
I'll see myself out.
No. Yeah. Thank you very much. Enjoy the veal. I'll be here all week.
Until 7.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Where you mentioned traditional agriculture. Where did you grow up? Where did this journey start for you?
Here in Canberra. Yeah.
back.
Yeah.
You're a Canberra girl.
Yeah, born and bred, mate.
There you go.
Yeah. No, my family were the Wogs that lived down on Mugger Lane, and they had a little small holding farm, fruit, poultry, few pigs and whatever. And even when I was born, they still owned it. It's still there, the farm. It's Canberra's a beautiful city because it still has farms inside its city borders, and I can get there probably in 5 minutes by car from here. And it was a beautiful place, and I just loved it. Like even the chicken barn, like that poultry barn, to me, I loved it, and I loved all the animals in there, but I also loved what was happening, like the production of things. Like that just made, like I was so excited by that. And so I just wanted to go to agriculture when I finished. I went to a Catholic girls' school for year 11 and 12. I went to boarding school in Yass, and then Catholic girls' school for year 11 and 12 back here in Canberra. And so then it was like, oh God, there's nothing at this school that tells, like I can use, like it was like biology, and that was it. And so then I didn't see a pathway to go to sort of like uni from there, and so I ended up going to the Monero and got my wool classes certificate and started rouseabouting, and the same story of pretty much any young kid that didn't go to uni and wants to be in ag. So had a dog, swore too much and thought that was cool. And so that's where it started. And then I moved to Goulburn. I got a job with the New South Wales Department of Ag on a sewerage sludge trial. And that was a really interesting and kind of formative thing for me as a young ag person, because it was only a year, and it was this intersection of agriculture and research. And what we were trialling it was back in the 90s, and so it was literally trialling the first, because they were trying to get approval for sewage sludge application in agriculture. And so it was a 10-year trial, and they were using rural trainees to man it. And there were 3 soil types, and sort of traditional to the southern tablelands, and we were running sheep on sort of dressings of this substrate. So it's like 30, 60 and 120 tonnes with a normal southern tablelands pastoral mix, and then merino ewes. So we would, data collection and farming and it's where I first fell in love, I guess, with sort of, we didn't have a name for it then, but regen ag. And because you looked at the paddocks that had even 30 tonnes per hectare of dressing compared to the superphosphate control, and the difference was just like you couldn't even argue it. Like it was just so incredibly like poignant. And then you would look at the 120, and we're in the middle of summer and it's flareous literally to your waist, and you couldn't find the sheep in there, and they were so fat they couldn't hardly get pregnant. And then you were like, fat score of 5, and like everything, they'd fall over and couldn't get back up. They were so fat, and it was the middle of summer. It was all green. And so it's like, how are you going to have an argument about that, right? Like, and so that was when I first realised that there were better ways of doing farming, and I just sort of stayed. I wanted to do that kind of thing more.
And where did that journey take you?
So I ended up having a bit of a tragedy. I was in Goulburn after working there, and my son died. And so then I took off to the Northern Territory, which is where everyone goes when life hits you a bit faster than you want it to. I worked at the export cattle yards for a full 3.5, 4 months, I think it was, which was hilarious. That was when I really realised that like the battle for gender equality was just not even started. So I remember first day and I wanted to be there so bad. I started my first day, and the guy goes to me, "We don't want you here." And I was like, "Because a good first start." It's like, "Good morning." And it was like 4 a.m, so it's like the wrong time of day for aggression. Like, do you know what I mean? And so, so I'm like, all right. And he goes, "We don't like women working here." He said, "Do you lot take too long in the toilets?" And I'm like, it's oddly specific complaint. And he's like,
we can probably change that.
Yeah. Lots of options here. And I was like, "Yeah, beaut." And then he was like, "You've got one toilet. We'll give you one toilet break a day." And he said, "But if otherwise, you're going to have to go in the yards with the rest of them." I said, "Oh," and I didn't care. I was like 21, so I was like, "You don't care, I don't care." Like, whatever, man. I just want to be here with all these beautiful cows. And so off we start, and then he sort of would be yelling at me from the front veranda. He'd be like, what are you walking for? And I'd be like, all right. Like, and I'm running everywhere. Nobody else had to. It was just me. So it was a bit of sport, I think, for them. And I'd pee in the yards with everyone else, which drove everyone mad. They're like, what are you doing? And I'm like, well...
Were you the only female there?
Yeah.
Bloody
it was
hell.
mental. So we loaded and unloaded cattle at those yards every afternoon and every night, and it was just mental. But it taught me so much about handling cows, and it was such a great experience. And then I ended up, once we finished up there, I moved to the US and started training horses, which was kind of cool.
Was it a love of horses that had followed you through and had taken you to the US? Or was it?
Like what girl doesn't love a horse? Like I don't really know if anyone doesn't want to be around horses. And it was more like someone had put me onto it. You've got to remember back then it was like late 90s, so there wasn't a lot of there was no Facebook or any of that to find these things, and I had to fill out this form and then fax it back to somebody to say I wanted to move to the US. I had one phone call with a dude, and then I got on a plane and flew over there. So it's like, you think about that now, and it's like now you'd be doing like Zoom calls and all sorts of like a lot more softer landing around going to a strange place. But I found out about it, and I just got on a plane and ended up in Stephenville, Texas, which has no, it's dry county. There's no alcohol there, and that was interesting.
So heavily Christian?
Very, yeah. It's the cowboy capital of the world. So Lane Frost is from there, and like all this sort of really, I know, big bull riders. That's it, it was a dry county, so I would ride my bicycle into town every day at 3 o'clock. So we worked from 1 to 3, so 1 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd get on my bicycle and ride 6 miles to town to drink at the one club where you were legally allowed to have a beer. It was just like, what a ridiculous thing to do. And I'm like, I will have a beer after work, gosh darn it. Yeah. And then I'd like pedal home. It's like, there's so much better things to do with your time, you idiot.
1 a.m. till 3 p.m.
Yeah, in the summer.
For those hours.
Well, 40. No, it's 45 head of horses to train, and only two groom strappers and the trainer. And then Texas summer, it's 110 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and cows they don't want to move around in that weather. So tried to get everything worked and done by sort of 10 o'clock in the morning. And then now you've got all the jobs to do. So you've got to clean all the stalls and feed everything and wash everything down and, feed cows and do all the rest, and then you'd be done. And then you'd do a quick feed in the afternoon, sort of 5 to 8.
After the pub.
Yeah.
After a quick bike ride, a couple of beers.
Yeah. And then living in my single wide trailer. Yeah, so.
How cool.
Yeah, it was cool, actually. I got to work with some really cool trainers. I got to work with some really great horses and drive big trucks. It was a good time.
How long were you doing that for?
So I did it for 5 years total, 5.5 years. Yeah,
Wow.
It was great. So, yeah, I got to see the world from a whole different perspective and ride some really beautiful horses and see some really good fun things. Yeah.
Could you have stayed there forever, or why'd you move?
Yeah, well, it was only I ended up in a not great relationship again, and classic. I'm a bit of a slow learner, I realise. And I had my second son, and I just could not stay like competing professionally or working with competitive trainers is like you're on the road all the time, you're working really long hours, and I had a small kid, and so I moved back into town and took a bunch of weird jobs, manning tanning salons and working at banks and trying to sort of make a living. It was really difficult because for me leaving Australia was sort of like giving up on ag a little bit, because horse training is an ag. It is, but it isn't. Like, don't hate me. Yeah, don't hate me, horse people. It's different. It really there is, right? Not to slice the die too finely, but I felt like I'd already sort of moved away from ag by doing horse training, and then finding myself managing a tanning salon was just like, geez, that
interesting career move.
Well, it's just desperation. Like you're just looking for any job, and when you've been in ag for a really long time, and then you're like, what have you done in the last 5 years? I'm like, train horses. What does that qualify you to do in the real world? Very little. Like, do you know what I mean? Like nobody's making those if she can do this, then she can do that stuff. And I still was young enough that I hadn't really progressed my career outside of general dog's body and willing to do a lot of work person.
Yeah.
And so, you just sort of end up in jobs that aren't necessarily what you thought they're going to be. But I actually learned a lot from them because it was the tanning salons are really big in the US, obviously. People are addicted to tanning, something I didn't know. I'm full of useful tanning trivia if you ever want to go down that rabbit hole.
It's taken me this long to think that it was just like a fake tan salon, not the beds.
Yeah.
Slow learner.
Yeah. Yeah, we had 14 beds in our tanning salon and 1 spray booth, and they do different things for you. So if you want a chocolate brown tan, you get in this booth. If you want a quick deep tan, you'd get into this booth. Like, I'm not joking. It's insane. But tanning salons make money on minutes people sit in a tanning bed, and you don't always use the full minutes, and then also tanning products. And so sales was like this massive thing for that organisation, and you were just trained to sell. And I'm really lucky because I can sell the legs off anything now.
Yeah,
just anything. Yeah, I was always kind of okay at selling stuff, but now it's like, oh, what do you want me to sell? Because I can sell tanning salon to people with ethnic backgrounds like mine who don't need tanning products at all. You should be browner, a different kind of brown. Not so much a red brown, so much as a chocolate brown.
Stand against this wall.
That's right, like a paint swatch.
Keep going.
What are you thinking? Yeah. So it just, I don't know. I when it was happening, I didn't like it. I was like really angry and really resentful, and I kind of scoffed and made fun of those jobs. And when I worked in the bank, it was the sort of same thing. Like, I was grateful to work, but I was just sort of like, oh, I want to go back to ag. But I didn't realise that these were actually jobs that were setting me up and giving me experience that now I'm really grateful for. I'm really glad I have, because I had professional training to get me there. It's kind of interesting when you reflect on it.
What was keeping you in the US?
I met a really beautiful man. It's always the reason. You meet someone that's just amazing, and you're like, oh, I could go home to Australia or stay here where children get killed by gun violence, and he's beautiful enough, I'll stay here where children get killed by gun violence. So we stayed. I met my husband Eric, and he was in the military, and so he was in the Marine Corps, and obviously the Iraq War had kicked. Well, 9/11 happened in my second year in the US, and then, of course, all of the Marine Corps started deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, and didn't stop until just recently, obviously. So he deployed his first time in 2003 with the invasion in Iraq, and then continued to deploy 4 or 5 more times through to 2012. So, yeah.
Would have been a pretty interesting time for you, having your husband pack up and leave and wondering if or when he'll come back.
Yeah, it was mad. Like, Australians have got a really close connection, obviously, with Anzacs, and like we connected to our military in a way, and I think we all have an affinity to the story of our veterans, but not like America does. And then living in a Marine Corps town, which exists purely to service this group of humans, and that group, the Marine Corps, of all of the services, the Marine Corps is the one that's most tribal, in my opinion. Like, you weren't an ex-army person. You can be an ex-army person, sorry, but you're never an ex-Marine. You are like, you can get out of the Marine Corps, but you are still a Marine. And so they've like got this really deep and very like embedded culture. And so when you're part of that organisation, you're like, it is super tribal. And so here you are living in this town that's mostly strip joints and chicken wing bars and laundromats, and
tanning salon,
and a few tanning salons and Baptist churches. It sort of just went like that. It's like strip mall, Baptist church, chicken wings, laundromat, tanning salon. You can see the cycle of life in front of you. You could in a day hit all of them and call it complete. So so we did all of that, and but during particularly the really sort of really kinetic part of the Iraq War, say 2004 through to 2009, you'd be at traffic lights because we're all wives. And so like we'd be at the traffic lights and there'd be four of us sitting in the cars, all not knowing each other, just crying. And people breaking down. You'd be like walking through Walmart and then you just hear someone start screaming and crying on the ground and you knew what was going on. And it's an odd place to be. Like that's surreal, right? Yeah. Like because you're not experiencing the war as an abstract through your news or because your mate Jerry has a brother who went or you have a brother that went. You're experiencing that collectively as a community and in a really impactful way. So it was like mental. It was really, really, really hard. Yeah.
What's it like to have walked away like from that part of what was the instigator for you or your husband to move on from the army? I couldn't do it anymore. So in 2010, I just sort of he was not well. He was just diagnosed with PTSD in his 5th deployment. And the Marine Corps at the time, he was with Special Forces, Marine Special Operations Command, and was an operator there. And as long as you self-identified and you got your ass to psych, they were happy for you to keep going. Sure, and but he was not well, and I wasn't well. Wives and family members and partners and husbands, they weren't as well either. Because to your point, when they deploy, you legitimately spend 9 months, 7 months, whatever their length is, thinking every day that you're going to get that call. And there was enough happening because we were in a combat unit that it was not if, but when. And so you don't realise how hard that is to actually move through until you move away with it and you're like, what was that? Why did we do that to ourselves for so long? But when you're in it, you're like, just becomes the cycle.
It just is what it is. And so, so I got to that and I just recognised that I was just becoming really resentful. I was getting really reactive to people dying, getting really aggressive about the whole thing. And I was working pretty closely with Marine Corps Special Operations Command at the time, and I was part of the Family Readiness program. We'd started a charity to support families because the irony of the military in the US is that they mostly live on the poverty line. So, as a young PFC without a family, you make about 18 grand a year. As a sergeant with a family, you make maybe 45,000 a year. And so your wife or your partner, husband, whoever is the human at home, tends to not work because how the hell can you work if you've got kids and you're a single parent? And so it's quite difficult to do. And so they just end up not working. So now you're at home with kids and most of them are really young and you spend most of your time thinking their dad or their mother is dead or might be soon. Yeah. And it turns you into a bit of a midget. And so we started this charity to be like, all right, we recognise our families are really stressed and they've been doing this war thing now for literally 10 years. How do we give them back? So we were making scholarships for wives to go and go to school again, or kids to go get tutoring because they suffer a lot of learning disabilities, military children, get them into sport because there's a higher rate of incidences of self-harm, suicidal ideation and depression in military kids. So it's trying to but when you're dealing with that and you're awarding scholarships to families who are literally Jimmy needs to take tennis lessons because he's cutting, he's 9, holy hell, it just hurts after a while and you can't sort of stop seeing it and you just want it to end. So I was like, I'm done. If you keep going, I can't stay. And he was like, no, I'm done too. So he had called and said, I can't keep doing this. And I'm like, all right, well, let's stop. So he had to do one more deployment after that. And then we got out. Yeah.
Job you can't quit.
No. Once you sign up, you got 4 more for the Corps is what they say. So every time, if you sign on the bottom line, it's a 4-year contract. And so you can decide for 1 year in, I'm done.
You got another 3.
3 more to go.
Huh.
Yeah. it's interesting.
What was it like coming back to Australia after a little while away?
Massive culture shock. Yeah, I'd changed a lot. Like what I love about America is they're just like they would champion, anything, anyone, anything, anyhow. Like they have an indomitable spirit for positivity and like that you can, right? Like that's just like baked into their brain. And all those cowboy movies where they're like, you're sort of super American, it's like that's still like such a beautiful thread in their culture. Like you can, like, and it comes out in different ways. But what I love about them is like my husband and I could be like, I think what I'm going to do is make ashtrays out of fecal waste. I'm going to sell them at the markets. He's like, excellent. I'll help, right? Like, and you're like, I don't know if that is an excellent idea, actually. And he'll be like, no, let's do it. Let's make lots of them. Where else can we, And so there's just nothing that you can't do in Americans' mind. And funnily enough, that in their world, I was like really pessimistic because I was still very Australian. So they'd be like, hey, how are you? And I'd be like, fine. And they're like, right, why aren't you being really friendly, because in Australia you would not yell across a quadrangle like that to like random people, but they're like, oh my God, it's you. They like make you feel like you're like the most important person in the room at all times. And I'm Australian, so I'm all like, I was like, what? And then over the time, I started to be like, hey, which for me, like I still wanted to peel my skin off because I was just like, this is a lot. And they were like, oh, okay, maybe you're not too bitchy, right? Yeah. And now I come to Australia, I'm like, hey, and everyone's like, all right, chill out, far out. We're just going for coffee. Why? It's like this really strange thing. But, it was time to be home and I was ready to come back. So it's been good. Yeah.
And when you got home, was this entrepreneurial spirit kind of ignited and were you keen to do your own thing, or where'd you find your feet once you got back in?
It was sort of this whole I didn't know who I was, and it's a hard thing. I think I've talked to a lot of people about this, and it happens in any industry that ends up being more of a culture or a way of life than it is just a job, right? So agriculture's very similar. It's not a job. It's how we live. It's who you are. It's part of the fabric of your identity. And when that changes or shifts or something breaks in that relationship, it's actually really hard to understand who you are, because you're like, well, if I'm not in the Marine Corps anymore, I'm not part of that big machine, who are we? And even though we didn't want to be there anymore, we didn't fit, because our jokes were really dark and kind of gross, and our experiences were really sad and tragic, but they were our normal experiences. And so we'd go to these parties and we'd be like, yeah, and then our friend Jimmy came home without legs, and everyone would be like, what? And we'd be laughing because like we know these stories of like funny things that have happened in these tragedies, and like people would be like edging back and like, I have to go and get an Ori Douvre now. Like, and we'd be left standing there going, oh, don't talk about the hard stuff. So it was super hard to find our feet or even find out where we belonged. And then I realised I had sort of naively thought that I'd just be able to come back to ag and get a job and it'd be fine. And
it wasn't.
No. Because when was the last time I'd worked in ag?
Yeah.
And look, now my resume was all upside down the other way, right? Like I was trying to get a job back in ag and they're like, you haven't been in ag since, Moses was put in a basket like ages ago. And even that experience has, you're nearly 40, you've got no management experience, you've got, in ag, you've got no extra courses, you've done this sustainability course. What does that even mean? Like I was literally back at the beginning again. And that was just really hard for me to try and reconcile, because I just sort of gone, if I just go home, I can go back to what was and it will be fine. And so that's why I think, I ended up really looking at the insect part, because it was like, well, maybe I'll just do it on my own. And we couldn't afford to buy a working farm because far out, that's just mental. And we had the credit rating of a 2-year-old. And so we were like, well, maybe we'll just buy, 10 acres and run chooks and sell them at the markets, the cost of feed was just mental. So it was originally just like make maggots to feed this
little chicken farm.
Yeah.
And it kept growing.
And then it was like making maggots is hard enough as it don't need to add the chicken farm.
And that's where the idea started, and it just kept incrementally growing.
Yeah, yeah. Isn't that weird? It's so interesting how that works, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me, when was the realisation that, you needed to focus on this maggot opportunity, or when was it an actual opportunity?
Yeah, so I was just like, I'll just make maggots and we'll just figure it out. We'll make them on the farm and then we'll sell it we'll feed it to the chickens and it'll be a thing. And so then I was like, we're living in town, so while I'm living in town, then we'll just try and figure out this maggot thing. And it took so long to get them to work because I didn't have climate control rooms or anything, and it's Canberra. Yeah. So like the period of time that the weather's like good and not extreme is like, this is like 2 minutes in spring and 2 minutes in autumn. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I had flies in my kitchen in this like plastic dome because it was like the closest thing I could do to climate control. And then I had the maggots on a heat pad and under an electric blanket in my garage. So like, again, not optimal. And getting them to just cycle was just hard in those kind of conditions. But once I finally got them to do it and I realised what I needed to do and that sort of felt easy, then you could see the opportunity for how big it would get. And then at that point I was like, this will take up all your time. Like you're not doing any other, you're already farming, trying to make insects. You're not going to be then going, now that I'm finished 10 hours of that kind of farming, let me go mess around with a chook for a second, No, thank you. So that was sort of there. And then that as that colony grew, then it's sort of the logistics of how that business would work and the model of that business is where it started to evolve. Because it's like, okay, well, now we're going to just farm the maggots. I'm the maggot lady. That's cool. But like now it's like, where do I get all the food waste from? And so it's just these sort of step changes in understanding the business, I think.
And the most peculiar thing, because I feel like most people in Australia are like, these bloody flies, I want to get rid of them. And you're like, make more. How do we get more flies?
I know. I always laugh. One of the things I used to say back in the day was like I started as a maggot farmer. I was like, I'm ending as a maggot farmer. The location is different. It's like, I don't know, like when you start with sheep, it's like kill every maggot, kill every fly. And I'm like, please live. Yeah. If you guys could just have sex. So If you guys could just have a little bit more sex and lay a few more eggs, that'd be really grand. Like what has changed? But I love it. Like insect farming is like it's so interesting because there's still so much room to be creative. So like your opportunities to be creative in intensive ag or conventional ag are still there, but they're now in the margins of efficiencies, right? Like our EBVs, like we're looking like for a 0.5% improvement. These are like massive things. Like you can really like shift the needle by big margins just by learning new things. And so there's this really beautiful opportunity to be super creative in this industry that, again, you can be creative in conventional agriculture, but you're now in the margins of creativity, right? Like a different kind of cow or a different kind of crop or, thinking about it this way. But this is like, if we actually just change these parameters, holy crap, this has changed. Do you know what I mean? So there's just something a bit fabulous about that and exciting that, keeps you coming back.
Yeah, it's crazy. And it's because there's not many in Australia that are actually in this insect game. Is it big globally?
Like it's big as far as emerging industries are concerned. And Australia's got some pretty good people like coming up now. We've got probably there's about 5 or 6 that are starting to really get some stride and get some commercial capability going on. And, guys over in Western Australia, Future Green Solutions, they've been running the longest fish feed trial in the world, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going to give it to him anyway.
Yeah,
let's just say it's true. Yeah, it's on
newsbreaker.
Yeah. It happened on this podcast, therefore it's true. Luke, you owe me if you're listening. But so there's, as always, doesn't matter, the agriculture Australia is kind of leading and doing really meaningful things. But there's not like a lot of us.
You'd nearly be ready to set up an industry body, wouldn't you? Is that,
We did.
You have?
Yeah, well, because in Australia you can't talk to anyone if you don't have an industry body. So I started that in 2017.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the reins of chair went over to Duncan Rowland, who's the head of Stock Feed Manufacturers Council of Australia, who's just, if we're going to deal with regulation in feed and build a new industry that feeds into agricultural feed, like who better to chair the insect pro? Yeah. So I was like, please take that, and I just threw it at him. Essentially, I was like, baton, like, and then he caught it, and I was like, bye. It's like, it's not true. He was legitimately elected, and in due course, and rightly so. So he's just been a really massive help to the industry, because that's what you need, right? When all new agricultural industries need the support, input, and feedback from those stakeholders who's done the hard yards before you, right? Like, you can't start anything new if you haven't learned from those who've gone before you and from those who will be your stakeholders or your clients. And so, we're, as an industry, we're super fortunate that Duncan's like just been such a huge supporter, because he comes with such credibility in that industry.
That's cool. I want to take a slight sidestep and talk a bit about your people. I've had the chance to walk around and see some of them, but you started this off as a solo founder and started building a team. You've got a world of experience behind you in terms of what you've been through through your life. But where did you start, and as you were building the team, what were you looking for, and how did you work out who you needed to grab?
Yeah, I've always had lofty goals of the kind of team I wanted to build, and I think the hardest part as a single founder that I've found is that I didn't realise at the time that building a team as the only founder meant that you really had to be okay all the time. Like, you can't let your team see you go through a journey, and I've not been successful at that. Like, it's very hard to do. And so when things go to shit and you need someone to talk to, you are their person. They are not your person, and that is really hard and feels really lonely. And so, again, even though made probably just as many, if not more, mistakes and got right, what I've always tried to do is make sure that we have enough diversity of voice in the conversation that our aperture never closes in a way that makes us dangerous, right? And what I mean by that is, I think sometimes you can think that you know your industry, you know what you do, and so you don't need to ask outside the bubble of that. And I think that's where industries really end up a bit stuck, because and kind of reactive to any input from that outside. Don't tell us how to do that. You don't know how we do our business, leave us alone. You
just need to listen.
That's right. Yeah. And so I think what I've learned in my career is, it's like the things that you're going to learn and the things you need to learn aren't always going to come from the place where you think they're going to come from. And in fact, you should hope that that's true, we started out of luck that we found some people that had moved to Cranmer recently, and they weren't allowed to work, or could work but couldn't get jobs. So like people with like literal PhDs or lawyers, like we had one who was a lawyer who worked at The Hague and could not get work doing anything but pulling beers in Australia because she wasn't a citizen. And she worked for us for like nearly a year. Yeah. And what I learned from having those people on board early was, it's like different walks of life doing different kinds of jobs think about things differently, and that there's some beautiful magic that happens there. So now we've kind of got this team that's like really diverse, come from all walks of life, doing all kinds of jobs, and have this ability at Goterra. So it's more than 25% of our workforce is working with disability, but not in sort of the more conventional working with disability approach, where people are like, oh, here's our working for a disability person, and they are on a broom. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, we're like, no, how can we give meaningful careers to people who have disabilities? And is it possible? And it is. And so because of that, though, we've got lots of different ways of thinking, engaging on problems. And so we tend to be able to solve problems a lot faster, I think, here than what we would if we had lots of people who all think the same about the same thing. Yeah.
How on earth do you go building that kind of culture in the early stages that has the ability to attract and encourage people from diverse backgrounds to actually come in?
Like, again, we haven't always got it right. I think I was really fortunate in the disability side of things that we had a disability work person called Alistair come to work for us, and he just taught me so much about what it meant to have to be legitimately employed. And what he meant by that was like, I have a job because I am good at my job. I don't have a job because you need me here cheaply or because you're trying to do some sort of token thing. Like, you actually appreciate me for my work. And so I learned from him that all people really want to do is be seen. So it doesn't matter what, like any of us, like that's the whole group of us, right? But what we forget because of our unconscious bias is that some people don't get seen at all. So how do you make it so that you start off as a business that want people to come? So if we started with the ad, so the ad says minorities, disabilities, veterans are encouraged to apply. And I think that's just always just a signal, right? Because a lot of people, I know only because my husband came as an American and he couldn't get work. And this is a guy with the highest security clearance in American military, like a very distinguished career, and couldn't get a job because none of his experience was Australian. And so if the white guy from America can have that prejudice, we all know that the other people from countries where we don't look the same have even more difficulties, and women have even more difficulties. And so that was sort of the first bit to sort of create the permission. You are encouraged to try, right? So that was the first part. The second part was to recalibrate on what interviewing people meant. So if you're looking for people from diverse backgrounds, disabilities, different cultures, you've got to be prepared to not interview everybody the same to get the same outcome. So with disability work, we don't do any written tests. We do those verbally. But then sometimes depending on the disability, we'll actually send them the questions beforehand so that they can write their answers out, because their ability to answer on the fly is sometimes difficult if they're stressed. Yep. So just doing human things that don't affect the outcome for or against in any way. Like, they still have to answer the question. Yeah. It doesn't take away how hard it is or what they're trying to do, but just being more human in how we think about that, I think, has been the key part. And then we were just super fortunate that our head of people, Laura, isn't a head of people, and so she just found she was able to not look at people in buckets that are more traditional. And she'd call me and she'd be like, I need you to go interview this guy. One of the classic ones is a guy called Juan, who's our service technician up in Sydney. She said, oh, go interview this guy. She goes, his resume, I don't know, but like there's something about him that I just think you need to, you're up there, can you interview him? And I interviewed him, and she goes, it's for a part-time job doing this. And I'm like, cool. And then I interviewed him, like, yeah, like full-time but doing this. Yeah. She was like, what? I'm like, this guy is awesome. And he is. Like, he will fix anything, he'll do anything. And it turns out that he'd actually written his resume and taken a lot of his actual experience off, because he'd found that he couldn't get jobs. And so he came, when we hired him, he was working as a person cleaning a food court. But his career has been agricultural management, engineer, like managing people, training people. Like he's like exceptional. Guru. Yeah, he's a god. He's a mid-whisperer, we say. But we would never have found him if we hadn't been looking the right way.
What do you reckon your proudest achievement is that you've done here?
Yeah, like we've done cool stuff. Like we've commercialised tech real quick. We've got great clients that are incredibly impressive, and we've done a lot of work in a lot of really short period of time. But for me, it's like, turning up to work and seeing, people from all walks of life, all kinds of disciplines, loving the fact that they have a place that they can be themselves, that we haven't tried to change anyone. You can be rough as guts, you can be a PhD student, you can, and everything in between, and you still have a seat at our table. Like I said, haven't always got it right every time, but we've got it right most of the time, and it feels pretty awesome.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions, and I think it will flow in really nicely to that. So I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, if they get the chance to go back to a Year 10 class and give them life advice around pursuing a career in agriculture and this big wide thing we call the food system.
Yeah.
What would be your advice to them?
Ooh. Don't get hitched first. Stay single for a while so that you can really try quite a few jobs in quite a few regions, travel, see some other places. So if your hometown is Goulburn, get your first job in San Paulo on a banana farm. And if you want to stay in sheep and cattle, get your first job in horticulture. Understand what the parts of the food chain and the agricultural systems that bump up against the place you want to be. Understand that first, because when you come back to the place that you want to be, you will have just a better understanding of how to do your job well and why those people matter. If you can have that shared understanding, then you're actually going to be much better at your job than you would if you just stayed drinking bath water in the sheep station. Do you know what I mean? Never really understanding the rest. Yeah.
Take the blinkers off.
Take them right off. Throw them away.
I'm really interested in this one, what you're going to come up with. What's a question you'd like me to ask a future guest?
Oh.
That's a good sigh, isn't it?
Yeah. No, that's a good one. It's a thing. I want to come up with something profound, and now I'm like stuck because my brain's just like flatline. How can agriculture lean into the feedback of its customers instead of rejecting the feedback of their customers? I think that's something we need to talk about a lot more. We don't want anyone telling us how to grow our food, and we're the only industry in the world who thinks we have the right to tell our customer that they don't have a right to tell us how to deliver what they want. Don't tell us how to do our job. And
interesting.
I would like to know how they would help agriculture turn that around and use it to their benefit.
It's interesting. I've had, I reckon, over the last few months, on 2 occasions where I've been sitting in a room, completely different people, one from an fishing background, one from a beef background, and they just the consumers just need to accept that it is what it is, and they just need to listen to us. And I was like, yeah,
that's interesting.
Wow. And for me, I was like, who needs to do the listening? And I don't, both sides probably.
Absolutely, right? But I think this is where we're confusing our lifestyle and our identity with our service provision and our product. They're not the same thing. And I think that's where we're getting mixed up, because we're like, when people say, I want you to grass feed my beef and you're a feedlotter, I feel like the response indicates to me that you're not hearing, hey, I have an impression that this is a better way. Can I get that, please? And then mitigating that on your own terms, either with more education or changing whatever. Instead, you're hearing the way you do life, the identity of you, the thing that you are most proud of. I don't like it. I want you to stop.
Yeah.
And I think we take personally the feedback of our clients. Volkswagen does not take it personally when I tell them I want white interior seats instead of black. They just give me an option to have white interior seats instead of black.
Yeah.
They don't go, oh, you couldn't possibly. And they sure as heck don't say, you'll get whatever interior seat colour we tell you you're going to get. Yeah, I think we can hold our culture and hold our identity, but separate it from the feedback from our customer who wants better. And ironically, if we joined them on that journey, the relationship would be better.
Imagine what we could do.
I know. It'd be pretty kick-ass.
Yeah.
now I got to think I'm going to ask that question.
I didn't phrase it well. That's up to you, Ollie. That's your job.
I think you've nailed it. Well, Olympia, thank you so much for having me in for a chat. It's been an awesome hour.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It was a real pleasure, Ollie. Thanks for your time.